Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson and I am an author. Today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest inspirations to my writing, that being Kingdom Hearts. Actually, you can't see it very well, but I'm wearing a Kingdom Hearts hoodie right now. Kingdom Hearts is my favorite video game franchise from both a gameplay and a story perspective. The series ended with Birth by Sleep, which, to be clear, I'm glad it didn't. It would have the best story in gaming, period, in my opinion, of course. The entries after BBS kind of muddy things up a little bit, but it's still really good. Now, there's a lot I could talk about when it comes to Kingdom Hearts, but I think one of the most impressive parts of Kingdom Hearts storytelling is how perfectly it nails its prequels. This is referring to both Birth by Sleep, which we'll be focusing on today, but it also refers to the mobile game Union Cross. From a story perspective, these two games are by far my favorite in the franchise, and this is coming from a franchise where I love the story of almost every single game, so that's no small feat. Almost, kind of just because Kingdom Hearts 3 exists. See, after I finished my book, The Heart of the World, my mind was buzzing with all sorts of ideas on what to do next. I was writing it with the intention of it being a trilogy, so of course, I was thinking about the sequels, but another idea popped into my head too. There was a lot of unexplored ground that came with our villain, Joe Avery, and wouldn't it be really cool to sit down and make a prequel exploring his past? There were a lot of fun ideas that came with this because I had hinted at a lot of things in The Heart of the World that could be expanded upon in fun ways, relationships that are hinted to have existed in the past and that sort of thing. But when I sat down to give a crack at writing this thing, there was something I noticed. Prequels are hard. Because of their very nature, a prequel kind of leaves you dealing with a story where the audience already knows the ending and likely already knows several of the big plot twists that you could manage to drop on them. Like in this hypothetical Heart of the World prequel, the fact that the protagonist winds up becoming the villain could be a big plot twist, but given its nature as a prequel, my readers would already know that's going to happen, like, it's a prequel focusing on the villain's backstory. Of course he becomes the villain, that's the whole point. So, I wanted to take a look at Birth by Sleep and see what Kingdom Hearts did that made it such a great prequel. It should probably go without saying, but this video will contain spoilers for the Kingdom Hearts series. So, before playing BBS, the relation to it is going to be kind of weird, because assuming you're playing things in order, you already know the climax before the game starts. It first appeared in Kingdom Hearts 2 as the secret ending cutscene, then most of it reappears in the intro for BBS itself. And even for a prequel, knowing the climax to the story before it begins is kind of strange. But there's also another part to it that changes our relation to the story before it begins, and it's the fact that we learn pretty quickly that this is a prequel, but we've never seen any of our protagonists before. The only ties we have with any of these characters to the present is how Ventus looks like Roxas, though we have no idea why, and this old man is apparently Xehanort, who's Heartless and Nobody are the main villains of Kingdom Hearts 1 and Kingdom Hearts 2 respectively. This does two things for us. Number one, it creates this sense of foreboding that's looming over the whole story. The climax that we already know about is the protagonists getting their butts kicked by the villains, and that we don't know these characters before BBS began makes us wondering, what happened to them? Did they all die? Kinda seems that way right now. Secondly, this version of Xehanort is way older than the version we're familiar with. Ansem and Xemnas, Xehanort's other forms, were adults, but this Xehanort is an old man. Despite this apparently taking place in the past, so what gives? And furthermore, Ben's resemblance to Roxas, a character we do know, is also kind of baffling. We know Ben must have something to do with Roxas, but is also Roxas is Sora's nobody? So how in the world does any of this work? both of these things set up a couple of good mysteries that we want to solve. And that right here is the first piece of the puzzle as to why BBS's story is as good as it is. It uses its status as a prequel to create a sense of foreboding and mystery. A lot of prequels focus on some part of the past, answering some question that was proposed in the original work, but not BBS. There are some questions it does answer, which we'll get to later, but these answers never feel like the point of BBS, and the questions that the game confronts you with right at the beginning aren't questions that existed before playing the game, or at least not before seeing the secret movie. Now, we have seen Ben one time in the past, but we didn't actually know who he was, and we only saw him for maybe a second or two. This, if you're unaware, is the scene in 358 over 2 days where Cheon briefly looks like Ben to Zigbar, but it's when BBS actually started, for me at least, that I started wondering about this question. The whole 358 over 2 days scene is just kind of like, oh, cool, that's neat. Now, there are some complaints a lot of people have that the relationship between our protagonists isn't as well defined as it could be, and I don't wholly disagree. But to be clear, when I say BBS is a perfect prequel, that doesn't mean it's a perfect story. I'm meaning more specifically that it fills its role as a prequel perfectly. After those initial moments, the story turns and mostly focuses on its own thing. The events that we see in BBS weren't ever really touched on in any of the previous games, and this left a lot of the in-between moments from now until the climax feeling just as fresh as a regular story. However, it's also still very much a prequel because we meet a lot of the characters who will eventually meet again in the future, only now, of course, they're a lot younger. A big thing about a lot of these encounters, though, is they're more like fun nods to the future than any big confounding mysteries. Cinderella is already a full-blown princess by the time of Kingdom Hearts 1, but in BBS she's still being bullied by her stepmom and that sort of thing. Miki has yet become a Keyblade master and is currently training under Yoden Sid, and we see many of the organization members, mainly Bray, Lee, and Issa, but before they became nobodies. And of course, we get to see Radiant Garden before it became Hollow Bastion. The big thing about a lot of these encounters, though, is they feel really natural. To some extent, this is really easy for Kingdom Hearts, because the premise of the game in the first place is to kind of hop around from world to world. So the game can just choose which Disney world would best fit with we're in the past, and it just feels like good old Kingdom Hearts. But even in the cases of like Lee and Issa, these characters' appearance always serve to further the plots of our new characters, Ven, Aqua, and Terra. While in truth they're obviously only there because they appeared in the previous games, it never feels that way. They never feel terribly out of place. Ven is the only one to meet Lee and Issa, for instance, because he's the only one it makes sense for in the story. They're not artificially shoved into Aqua and Terra's story for no reason. And finally, we reach the climax of the ending, and I think this is probably the most important part, because we already know a good chunk of what's going to happen here, and as we've been steadily learning about the story and what's happening, we've probably already figured out a good chunk of why it happens too. So, how do you take a climax that we already know and make it into something we're invested in? The answer is we don't actually know the climax as well as we think we do. There's a lot here that gets added into the mix that we didn't see before. Sure, we knew Ven gets turned into a popsicle and dropped off a cliff, but we didn't know that Braig was there, and we didn't know that Ven winds up getting possessed by Vanitas, and we didn't know about Vanitas' face, and we didn't know about Terra getting possessed. And of course, the answers to our questions come out in these crucial moments. Why does Ven look like Roxas? Well, it's more accurate to ask, why does Roxas look like Ven? Because Sora lent Ven's heart his strength, causing Vanitas to look like Sora. And when Ven's heart was then shattered, Sora took Ven's heart within his own, causing Roxas to look like this other heart. And the reason why Master Xehanort is so old here compared to Ansem and Xemnas is because those versions of him were created from Terra's body after Xehanort possessed it. And not only that, but it even answers a couple questions we didn't even know we had. We learned that Castle Oblivion was originally the land of departure, but Aqua turned it into Castle Oblivion to hide Ven until she found a way to wake him up. And we learn that the reason Sora has 2 Keyblades in Kingdom Hearts 2 is because one of those Keyblades belongs to Ven. And I think this is the big second piece of the puzzle that makes BBS so good. It recontextualizes things we already knew about, but weren't particularly dying for answers for. Like, sure, where Castle Oblivion came from was a little bit of a mystery, but for me at least, it was never like a big mystery hanging over my head. I just kind of assumed it belonged to the organization. And Sora and Roxas wielding 2 Keyblades was a little jarring at first, but by the time Kingdom Hearts 2 wrapped up, I had just kind of accepted it. Sora not looking like Roxas was probably the only big question that I had that BBS answered, but honestly, in retrospect, I'm not even sure there was that much proof for Nobody's and their human counterparts looking the same at all. We only knew all of the other Nobodies as Nobodies. We didn't know how they looked when they were alive at the time. But there's one other thing that BBS does that really hammers it home. After all of this, Aqua and Terranort fight, and as a result of this battle, Aqua is lost to the Dark Realm while Terra gets taken away by Ansem the Wise. We know what happens to Terra here. He goes on to become Ansem and Xemnas and does all the bad guy things. But Aqua is lost in the Realm of Darkness, and Ven is half dead in Castle Oblivion. He had no idea about either of these things before Birth by Sleep. The game furthest along in the timeline at this point was Kingdom Hearts 2, which just kind of ended off with a happy ending. The main trio was back home, all the bad guys were defeated, and we were kind of just under the impression everything was good now. But apparently we have 2 allies that need saving and have needed saving for a decade. The third and final piece of what makes BBS such a great prequel is that it sets up something to be taken care of in the future. Most prequels are designed in a way where they lead directly into the first entry of a story and then that's it. They're done. But that's not how BBS or Union Cross works. Both of them not only tell you what happened in the past, they set up things in a way that what happened in the past is going to have an effect on what's happening in the present, setting up the next major plot line. Now, whether the payoff to these plot elements was any good, it wasn't, is another matter. But that's more of a problem with the games that came later rather than BBS itself. BBS has its problems, for sure, but it really opened my eyes to the potential a prequel can have. Because in the regards to being a prequel, it is darn near perfect. Of course, it has its own prequel, in the form of Union Cross, which introduces some random stalker girl who then gets immediately murdered in an alleyway, so I'm pretty sure we all know which one of the prequels is better. Okay, bye now.